Glory be to Jesus Christ. Okay, wonderful. Before we begin the official opening, I would like to ask Father Ruslan to conduct an opening prayer for the gathering. So if you could please stand.
Помолимося. В ім'я Отця і Сина, і Святого Духа. Амінь. Отче наш, що єси на небесах, нехай святиться ім'я Твоє, нехай прийде царство Твоє, нехай буде воля Твоя, як на небі, так і на землі. Хліб наш насущний дай нам сьогодні, і прости нам провини наші, як і ми прощаємо винуватцям нашим, і не веди нас у спокусу, але визволи нас від лукавого. Бо Твоє царство, сила і слава Отця, Сина і Святого Духа, нині повсякчас, віки віків. Господи, благослови нашу сьогоднішню зустріч, благослови нашу церкву тут, в Америці, в усьому світі, благослови товариство Святої Софії. Тобі славу висилаємо на віки віків. Амінь.
Dear friends, as the war in Ukraine consumes tens of thousands of lives, the most recent is the assassination of Ukraine's finest linguist and champion for the Ukrainian language, Professor Irina Faraon. As the United States faces deep social fraction amidst the forthcoming presidential election, we, I'm sure, live in a state of deep insecurity. Is Ukraine to withstand the battle for its existence? Who are the allies and who are the enemies? What messages are the world leaders sending out as Ukrainian towns and cities are being plundered, occupied, or wiped out from the face of the earth? Tonight, we are gathered here for a thought-provoking discussion on one of the most influential voices, or at least we would like to think so, the voice of the Vatican. The Pope's tightrope walk, walking a narrow line between diplomacy and moral clarity in the context of Russian aggression against Ukraine, is presented by Dr. Anatole Babynskyi, a postdoctoral fellow at the Faculty of Theology, University of Notre Dame, Indiana, and a research fellow and lecturer at the Institute of Church History at Ukrainian Catholic University. Dr. Babynskyi graduated from Lviv Commercial Academy and received his doctorate from the Faculty of Philosophy and Theology at Ukrainian Catholic University. He has worked at the Religious Information Service of Ukraine, served as the chief editor of the Patriarchate Journal, and conducted research at the Metropolitan Andrei Sheptytsky Institute of Eastern Christian Studies, St. Michael's College, University of Toronto. Please welcome Dr. Babynskyi.
Thank you very much for this invitation. At the outset, let me express my gratitude. Gratitude for your help to Ukraine and for this invitation to speak here. It is a great honor for me. The focus of my research for many years has been the history of the patriarchal movement and the Ukrainian Catholic Church in the diaspora. Unlike historians of ancient Rome, who can only touch the ruins of their subject of research, I have a privilege of engaging with more than just ruins. And unlike the relics of ancient Rome, the Saint Sophia Association is a living testament to that history and a vibrant and enduring institution. The title of my presentation is The Pope's Tightrope Walk, Navigating between Diplomacy and Moral Clarity in the context of Russian aggression against Ukraine. I must say that I too find myself on a similar tightrope when speaking on this topic. Despite considerable criticism of the Holy See's stance on the Russian aggression against Ukraine, the Pope and the Vatican diplomats working on this issue are not enemies of Ukraine. Pope Francis has addressed the war several hundred times and continues to do so almost every week. However, most of these addresses go unnoticed by the public, while only a few of his statements are make headlines. I would like to start by highlighting three aspects of this topic, which I will elaborate on later. In other words, there are at least three levels at which the Vatican interacts with the issue of Russian aggression against Ukraine. The first concerns how the Holy See reacts to wars in general. There have been many wars in the world, and the Holy See has developed its own algorithms for responding to them. The current debate over the position of the Holy See during the World War II shows that these algorithms are not problem-free and may need to be revised. The second pertains to a specific region and the Holy See's view of the part of the world where Ukraine is located. No matter how you evaluate it, the fact is that for centuries the Holy See has been building its strategy in relation to Eastern Europe with an eye on Moscow and the Russian Orthodox Church. The third is a personality of the Pope himself. We Ukrainian Catholics are well aware of how important the Pope's personal history and his view of the world are. In 1960s and 70s, representatives of the Roman Curia and Pope Paul VI voiced many arguments against Patriarch Joseph Slipei convening a Synod of Bishops of the UGCC. But Pope John Paul II swiftly resolved the matter. The discussion about the Vatican's position in the context of Russian aggression against Ukraine began long before the start of the open Russian invasion. Already in February 2015, the words of Pope Francis, who called the events in Donbass a fratricidal war, caused outrage in Ukrainian society. Given other statements of Pope Francis, particularly the encyclical Fratelli Tutti, we can infer that he considers any conflict in the world as a fratricidal. However, in the Ukrainian context, these words were read differently. Russian propaganda has presented the proxy aggression in Donbass as a civil war, a narrative that was intended to obscure Russia's role and diminish the perception of it as an external aggressor. Thus, when the Pope's terminology aligned with the fratricidal framing, it inadvertently echoed and legitimized the Russian narrative, which Ukrainians found misrepresentative of the true nature of the events. Despite this, due to the hybrid nature of the smoldering war in Donbass, the principle of impartiality that the Vatican adheres to in the case of interstate conflicts did not arouse as much negative emotions as it did after the February 24th. On the contrary, shortly before Russia's open invasion of Ukraine, both Ukrainian politicians and representatives of the Catholic Church sought to involve the Vatican as a mediator in negotiations between Ukraine and Russia. They expressed hope for a visit by the Pontiff to Ukraine, which, in opinion of many, could draw the world's attention to Ukraine and thus prevent war. According to the Razumkov Center, as of 2020, Pope Francis had the highest level of trust in Ukraine among all Ukrainian and foreign religious leaders, about 45% among all of Ukrainians. And I must admit that only 10% of Ukrainian populations are Catholics. The first reaction from the Vatican to the beginning of the open Russian invasion was in the spirit of impartiality. Secretary of State Cardinal Pietro Parolin noted that Pope Francis was upset by the deterioration of the situation and recalled the Pontiff's words from the day before, urging both parties to refrain from any actions that could cause even more suffering to the population, destabilize the coexistence between peoples, and discredit international law. Along with these cautious statements, Cardinal Parolin avoided using the words aggression and invasion, instead using terms from the Russian propaganda dictionary, referring to a Russian special military operation on the territory of Ukraine. In his turn, Pope Francis, departing from the diplomatic protocol, visited the Russian embassy to the Holy See on February 25th, where he expressed his concern about the events in Ukraine. In the weeks and months that followed, the Pope's rhetoric kept changing. By March the 2nd, Pope Francis called the events in Ukraine a war. On March 13, the Pope Pontiff used the words armed aggression for the first time, and on March 27th, he referred to it as an invasion. However, during these 2.5 years, the Pope has largely avoided directly referencing who initiated the war. Only on a few occasions, and not to a wide audience, such as an interview with the American Jesuit magazine America, did he explicitly state that, quote, certainly the one who invades is the Russian state. This is very clear. Sometimes I try not to specify so as not to offend or rather condemn in general, although it is well known whom I am condemning. It is not necessary that I put a name and surname. It is noteworthy that it was in this interview that the Pope said that the, quote, the cruelest are perhaps those who are of Russia but are not of Russian tradition, such as the Chechens, the Buryats, and so on. And these words spread throughout the world, prompting the Holy See to later apologize to Russia through diplomatic channels. Numerous examples illustrate this tightrope walk of the Pope, including the kissing of the Ukrainian flag from Bucha and the scenario of the Stations of the Cross, his words about Great Russia of Peter and Catherine, and the characterization of Patriarch Kirill as a Putin's altar boy. This is rather a long list. There was a lot of subjectivity in all these actions and words, but it is important to know that Pope Francis has sometimes gone beyond the established protocols for responding to war developed by the Vatican, and he gone beyond as no one before him. At the same time, in most cases, he followed the usual trajectory that the Holy See follows in the event of any international conflict, which is described by the word impartiality, or in modern language of the Holy See, positive neutrality. Cardinal Pietro Gasparri, Secretary of State from 1914, is credited with architecting the Vatican's policy of the impartiality, which was implemented during the First World War under the Pope Benedict XV. According to this plan, this policy was supposed to leave the Holy See and the Pope with the possibility to condemn the principles or policies of states and parties without mentioning specific names or countries, so that the Holy See would not be drawn into party struggles or find itself on one side of a conflict. Pope Benedict XV personally emphasized that impartiality should not be confused with neutrality because the latter is passivity. Instead, according to him, the Pope should take an active position for the reconciliation of all people on earth, while maintaining a fervent affection for all his children, not selectively but in most impartial way. Due to the Lateran Treaties of 1929, the Holy See, quote, shall take no part in any temporal rivalries between other states, nor in any international congresses called to settle such matters, save and except in the event of such parties taking a mutual appeal to the pacific mission of the Holy See, the latter receiving in any event the right of exercising its moral and spiritual power. Such an impartial position truly allows the Holy See to remain free in international relations and helps it to fill these relations with the values of the gospel, rather than to reinforce existing conflicts and create new ones. At the same time, it encourages people to expect the clear moral position from the Church, when other participants in international relations are only following their own geopolitical or economic interests. We can assume that certainly we can assume with certainty that the high trust of the Ukrainians in the Holy See, which was observed on the eve of the Russian invasion, was precisely the fruit of such expectations. However, this trust has fallen over the course of these 2.5 years to a level that is now less than the percentage of Catholics in Ukraine, somewhere around 3-4%. Russia's aggression against Ukraine is very similar to the German invasion of Poland in 1939, and the Vatican's reaction in many aspects is no exception. On the eve of the German invasion of Poland, the Vatican tried to mediate between the two countries to prevent war, even at the expense of territorial concessions from the Poles, as Pius XII believed that the war would cause Poland much more harm. After the German invasion, in his encyclical Summi Pontificatus, the pontiff, without naming the aggressor, briefly mentioned, quote, "the nation swept into the tragic whirlpool of war," and expressed solidarity and sympathy for the Polish people. The diplomatic activity of the Holy See on the eve of the war and the Pope Pius XII's restrained reaction to open aggression provoked a wave of disappointment in Polish society. On the other hand, the position of the Holy See gave German propaganda a wide scope for manipulation. Similarly, today, the position of the Holy See is interpreted by Russian propaganda as balanced, corresponding to Russian narratives that not everything is so clear. I specifically mention the event of the Second World War here because the discussion of Pope Pius XII's position often overlaps with the discussion of Pope Francis' position on Russian aggression against Ukraine and the international order as a whole. Both the actions of the Nazis in World War II and the current actions of Russia raise the question of how far one can go down the road of impartiality without contradicting one's own moral values. The Russian attack is not just aimed at seizing territory. It is aimed at destroying the system of human rights and value of human dignity, which the Catholic Church considers fundamental to its social doctrine. Solidarity with the victim is clearly not enough in this situation. It does not actively confront and counteract the aggressor's actions. Ideology and importantly, the weaponization of religion. To effectively support the victim and uphold justice, a more proactive stance is required. This includes unequivocally condemning the aggression, advocating for concrete actions to protect the victim, and working to uphold international law and human rights. Without such firm and active response, the aggressor's actions might continue unchecked, leading to further erosion of fundamental human values and prolonged suffering for the victims. Returning to the example of World War II, it is often argued that Pope Pius XII's cautious stance on Nazis' actions was due to the fear that strong condemnations would provoke or could have provoked further atrocities, including against Catholics. This is indeed plausible. I've heard a similar concern about potential reprisals expressed by the representative of a Catholic aid organization. She suggested that a more assertive papal position against Russian aggression could have led to the complete eradication of the Catholic presence in Russia. I have no doubt that the Russian government is capable of such thing. However, I would like to place this question in a broader context. Consider how the Vatican has worked to build its relations with Ukraine and Russia since the collapse of the Soviet Union. Over these 30+ years, the Ukrainian and Russian files have, figuratively speaking, been kept in the same folder. In many cases, the way the Roman Apostolic See or the Holy See has interacted with Ukrainian religious communities or state has been influenced by how these interactions could be perceived by Moscow or the Moscow Patriarchate. This includes issues like the Patriarchate of the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church or relations with the Orthodox Church of Ukraine. Despite excellent relations with the Ecumenical Patriarchate, which granted autocephaly to this new church, the Vatican has been mindful of Moscow, overlooking one of the largest Orthodox churches in Europe. This approach culminated in the Havana meeting and declaration. The meeting did not achieve significant progress in ecumenical relations or contribute to resolving global conflicts. Instead, the declaration discussed Ukraine while ignoring the Ukrainian perspective. As with the previous question of impartiality, Pope Francis is not its author. Here we can see a certain inertia, although not all predecessors of the current pontiff followed this line to the same extent. This approach can be traced back to the period after the Napoleonic Wars, when the Russian Empire established itself as one of the pillars of European security and stability, as it was understood then in Rome. Consequently, the Vatican often turned a blind eye to how St. Petersburg treated Catholics, especially Greek Catholics, in order not to disrupt this security architecture. When in 1839 the Greek Catholics in Russian Empire were absorbed by the Russian Orthodox Church, Rome limited its response to condemning the Uniate hierarchs rather than the Russian authorities who orchestrated these events. In more recent time, this approach was manifested in so-called Vatican's Ostpolitik, which reached its height in the 1960s and 70s. The Ukrainian diaspora in the United States is well acquainted with its course, having repeatedly protested against it. This strategy and its results are very ambiguous. It can be interpreted as a church analog of Realpolitik, seen as a betrayal of values and principles in the hope of achieving a dubious goal, or as an art of the possible. Thanks to Ostpolitik, for example, Joseph Slipy was released from the Gulag, and the modus non moriendi was found for Catholics behind the Iron Curtain in the 60s and 70s, which later contributed to the decline of communism and the democratic transformation of Eastern and Central Europe. Russia's aggression against Ukraine has brought these questions to the forefront again. For some, the war has become further proof that Ostpolitik is inherently false, as it is exploited by those forces, particularly Russia, that see relations with the Holy See as merely one of many tools to achieve their own goals on the geopolitical chessboard. Others, like it was in the 19th century, believe that there is no alternative to dialogue at any cost with Moscow in the face of the threat of a nuclear catastrophe for all of humanity. At the church level, Ostpolitik resulted in the beginning of an ecumenical dialogue with Moscow Patriarchate, which often developed on a separate track from the dialogue between Rome and Constantinople and the wider Orthodox world. This special exclusive attention to the Russian Orthodox Church indicated that from Rome's perspective, the key to restoring unity with Eastern Orthodox churches lay in Moscow. If an agreement could be reached with the Russians, it was believed that it would open the door to the desired unity. The Moscow Patriarchate was well aware that they held the golden share in Rome's view and used this dialogue to achieve their own goals, particularly in Ukraine. At the same time, even the most prominent professional ecumenists, like Hilarion Orfeev in the Russian Orthodox Church, emphasized that unity with Catholics was impossible to achieve. The Russian aggression became a litmus test for the ecumenical dialogue between Rome and Moscow, revealing the extent to which it truly had ecclesiastical character and goals, and to what extent it was instrumentalized by the Moscow Patriarchate. The involvement of Russian Church in constructing the ideology of Ruski Mir, which became the basis for the genocidal war, provoked only some critical statements from individual representatives of the Roman Curia, such as Cardinal Kurt Koch. However, the Vatican refrains from assessing the latest Russian ideology and the role of the Church in its creation and dissemination. However, certain occasional statements by Pope Francis and those close to him, such as Father Antonio Spadaro, suggest that the Vatican has not fully understood what has happened to the Russian Church, which has been fully engaged in the propaganda of aggressive ideology. Therefore, the current ecumenical dialogue needs to be completely rethought, as does the entire Vatican Ostpolitik. For instance, the Pope's word that war crimes could not have been committed by the representatives of the Russian tradition, or the attempt to distinguish between the great Russian culture and Russia's current action, indicate a belief that there is still a chance to return to the previous state of affairs, overlooking this unpleasant episode of the war against Ukraine. I think that we are dealing here with a situation similar to the current discussion about Russian culture. That is why I would like to draw a parallel here by quoting words of Pavlo Kazarin, who, in my opinion, very accurately conveyed the essence of the problem. Quote, "We are unlikely to achieve our goal if we call to abolition of someone else's cultural heritage. However, we have the right to demand that discussions of Russian war crimes not be replaced by discussions of Tolstoy and Chekhov. While we are not succeed in promoting a boycott of Russian culture, we must insist on viewing it through the decolonial lens. Each cultural artifact should be studied as a monumentum to the empire and an example of its official discourse, particularly regarding the conquered peoples. We cannot stop the West from discussing the European aspects of Russian culture, but this should not be an excuse for ignoring an anti-European nature of Russian state. The right not to judge Tchaikovsky by the actions of a Russian soldier is inextricably linked to the obligation not to judge Russia by Tchaikovsky. After all, Russia today is not represented by its culture, but it is represented by Bucha and Mariupol. The same procedure should be applied to Russian religious culture and the Russian church. Just as it is important to examine Russian culture through decolonial lens, it is equally crucial to scrutinize the Russian religious tradition. At the same time, this tradition should not serve as an indulgence for contemporary Russian Orthodoxy. For the further healthy development of ecumenical dialogue, it is a part of a moral duty to assess the Russian Church's role in shaping and propagating the ideology of Ruski Mir and the ideology itself. The Russian Church's close alignment with the state has led to its involvement in promoting nationalist and expansionist ideologies that have justified acts of aggression. This complicitly needs to be critically examined, rather than obscured by a nostalgic or romanticized view of Russian religious tradition. Unfortunately, in the face of such gross instrumentalization of religion, the Vatican has not chosen to act as a prophetic voice of moral assessment regarding the Russian Church's role in this war. Instead, it continues to rely on diplomatic means to maintain relations with the Moscow Patriarchate. This approach does more harm than good, undermining the credibility of Christian preaching, especially in Ukraine. By prioritizing diplomatic engagement over a principled stance, the Vatican risks compromising its moral authority and failing to address the profound issues at the intersection of religion and geopolitics. Returning to the situation of Russian Catholics, it should be acknowledged that they bear the same degree of responsibility for their country's actions as any other Russian citizens. If the Vatican is genuinely concerned about their plight, it should address the issue of religious freedom in Russia publicly, something that has never been done. This issue has always been shrouded in secrecy of diplomatic agreements. My final point concerns the personality of Pope himself. As I mentioned earlier, this is always of great importance. I'm convinced that Pope Francis genuinely sympathizes with Ukrainians and cares deeply about Ukraine. However, due to his upbringing and views on geopolitics, he does not always fully grasp the nature and essence of this war. For example, his description of the first phase of this conflict as a fratricidal conflict reflects this misunderstanding. Pope Francis shares many similarities with Pope John Paul XXIII, whom he canonized. Both are often referred to as universal parish priests because of their direct personalities, their propensity for improvisation, and their preference for personal contacts and meetings over protocol-driven diplomacy. Francis believes that a personal meeting can influence the movement toward social peace and should not be limited to, quote, pure and untainted people. This quote is from his encyclical Fratelli Tutti. This likely explains his eagerness to meet with Putin. On the other hand, Francis, with his Latin American background, is accustomed to the Church's existence under various political regimes and dictatorships. This experience may lead him to overlook issues related to the nature of the regime and human rights in places like China or Russia, focusing instead on creating the most favorable conditions for the Church's presence there. However, the validity of this approach, given the Church's social doctrine, remains an open question. This perspective may be one of the factors that distinguish Pope Francis from his predecessors. The history of Latin America in the 20th century is filled with numerous coups, armed conflicts, and revolutionary movements, including anti-colonial ones. The Catholic Church was frequently drawn into these conflicts, which eventually had a negative impact on it. Consequently, for many Catholics in the region, politics and especially geopolitics seems to be a dirty business. In contrast, Pope Francis has focused his pontificate on the ordinary men and women, whose suffering he views as often resulting from the clash of interest among the world's powerful. Frequently, the Pope's thoughts on the situation in Ukraine reflect this pattern. He expressed solidarity with those who suffer and considers the cause of this suffering to be the clash of global players, with Ukraine being a victim. I would suggest that in his worldview, Pope Francis faces a dilemma similar to that of Pope Pius XII, whom I have already mentioned. When the Americans urged Pius XII to make a strong condemnation of Germany, he replied that he could only do so if he also condemned Soviet totalitarianism. This may explain the Pope's comments about the barking of NATO and the need to move away, this quote, move away from the usual model of Little Red Riding Hood, urging to avoid reducing the Ukrainian-Russian war to a simple distinction between good and bad guys without considering the complex roots and interests involved. However, such an approach inevitably causes outrage among Ukrainian society, as it fails to acknowledge Ukraine's subjectivity and misrepresents the nature of this war. Not to mention that this interpretation easily fits the patterns of Russian propaganda. Unlike during the Second World War, this conflict does not involve a clash between two totalitarian regimes. In this war, there is only one side that has been aggressively attacked. And at the time of the first phase of the invasion, Ukraine was a neutral state. It is understandable that the Pope does not want to be seen as a chaplain of the West, but would abandoning a victim of aggression and neglecting to provide assistance to be a moral failing on the part of other nations? As Pius XII wrote after the Second World War, that in cases of unjust aggression, quote, the solidarity of family of nations forbids others from behaving as mere spectators, showing impassive neutrality. He also noted that it is impossible to measure the damage already caused in the past by such indifference to wars and of aggression, and that such an attitude only reassured and emboldened the authors and instigators of aggression. Finally, we should consider another personal aspect of Pope Francis, his approach to the issue of just war. The concept of just war in the Catholic Church has its roots in Saints Ambrose, Augustine, and remained largely unchanged until the 20th century. However, with the outbreak of the Cold War, a rethinking of some aspects of this concept began. Pius XII considered defensive wars to be just and emphasized that other nations have a duty not to abandon an attacked country in trouble. At the same time, he noted that even legitimate defensive wars carry the risk of escalating into larger conflicts with significant spiritual and material consequences. The rapid development of various types of weapons, especially the advent of nuclear weapons, led subsequent popes to express additional reservations about the possibility of a just war. Both Pope John XXIII, author of the encyclical Pacem in Terris, and his successors gradually moved away from this terminology, focusing instead on peace building and calling for the creation of a supranational, universally recognized body to resolve disputes between countries without resorting to arms. Nevertheless, since the threat of new wars remained, the fathers of the Second Vatican Council affirmed, quote, "As long as the danger of war remains and there is no competent and sufficiently powerful authority at the international level, governments cannot be denied the right to legitimate defense once every means of peaceful settlement has been exhausted." According to Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger, the issue of just war and the death penalty were the most controversial during the preparation of the Catechism of the Catholic Church, published in 1991. In 2005, the future Pope Benedict noted that in cases of aggression, quote, "defending oneself and others is a duty." In fact, both the Catechism and later the Compendium of the Social Doctrine of the Church list traditional conditions that justify the use of military force but refer to just defense rather than just war. Continuing the trajectory of his immediate predecessors, Pope Francis advocates for preventing wars through the development of effective and transparent mechanisms within supranational organizations, particularly the UN. At the same time, he's cautious against too broad interpretation of the right to legitimate defense, which could be used to justify preventive attacks or actions that may cause more harm than the evil they seek to eliminate. In one of his messages for the World Day of Peace, Pope Francis went further, stating that, quote, "responding with violence to violence leads at best to forced migrations and great suffering. Therefore, he believes that the best form of resistance is active nonviolence." However, this position does not always hold up with the realities of conflict, as aggression can sometimes only be stopped by weapons. For example, last year, Vatican guards had to open fire on a car driven by a man who had rammed the gates of the Vatican and attempted to break into the city-state. In the Ukrainian context, nonviolent resistance would only cause much more suffering, as human rights activist and co-recipient of the Nobel Prize, Alexandra Matvichuk, said. "Occupation does not reduce human suffering, it simply makes it invisible." In conclusion, the Vatican's tightrope walk in the face of Russian aggression reveals a complex interplay, as you have seen, of history, geopolitics, and religion. While the Holy See's pursuit of peace is commendable, its adherence to impartiality has often obscured the stark realities of the conflict. To truly uphold its moral authority, I think, the Vatican must move beyond diplomatic necessities and offer a clear, unequivocal condemnation of Russia's action. Only then can it hope to reconcile its pursuit for peace with its duty to stand in solidarity with the victims of aggression. The Church's moral authority is at stake. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Babynskyi, for a very elaborate presentation, taking into consideration historical, geopolitical, as you said, and ecumenical perspective. And at this point, I would like to open, obviously, our discussion. If there are any questions or comments that are, yeah, Gina, yes.
Hi, good evening, Doctor. Gina Christian from our Sunday Visitor News, actually, met briefly at Huku last summer. Question for you about genocide, because this war has been declared a genocide by OSCE, by two reports from New Lines Institute and Roe Wallenberg. Does genocide, and recognizing this as the genocide that it is, help the Vatican move beyond this logjam that it has with fully condemning these atrocities? Does it provide a path? Or is the Church's own guilt over not sufficiently recognizing the Holocaust preventing that?
As far as I remember, that during one of his speeches to the broad audience, Pope Francis compared this war with Holodomor, if I'm right. So I think that there is a understanding of the genocidal features of this war in the Vatican, within the Vatican. But I don't know really what prevents Vatican's officials to condemn these atrocities. You know, maybe, and we know that Vatican is working on the issue of repatriation of Ukrainian children from Russia and also prisoners of war. Of course, they would like to keep this track of dialogue with Russia open. But as far as I know, they weren't very successful in their dialogue with Moscow. So maybe it would be better to have this moral stance and to say what is black and what is white, because as far as I know, that only 2 children were repatriated from Russia due to the Vatican's, dialogue. Efforts. Yeah. So, but there are thousands of them in Russia. So we see that they are not successful. And for me, it's naturally to have like a more moral position in this situation.
Thank you. Okay, thank you, Gina, for your question. Levko может выйти. Leo Ivaskiev, please, editor.
Just extending that moral argument a step further, isn't there a danger, though nobody talks about it, a danger of losing souls? After all, the victims of oppression looking to the Pope for defense, and if they don't see it, can they not lose their faith?
I can only agree with you, because I also see this danger that the new wave of secularization in Ukraine might happen, and many people are losing their trust in the church structures, and particularly in Catholic Church. As I mentioned before, Pope Francis was the most trusted religious leader in Ukraine. About half of Ukrainians trusted Pope Francis before the war. Today, only 3-4% trust the Pope. And you know that there are 10% of Catholics in Ukraine. So we can say that even among Catholics, there is no so huge trust as or broad trust as it was before. So yes, I can face that. We can see this danger that people can lose their faith. Yes.
Mr. Chemdowski.
First, Professor, I'd like to say that you have tackled indeed a extremely, extremely difficult topic. And I commend you for having the courage to really lay out the entire scenario of Pope Francis's pronouncements. I believe that there's still room for expansion of that subject, which you have presented here, obviously in a very concise manner, because we do need an assessment of truly what did the Vatican say, when they said it, and what impact it had. So that needs to be done, and history will require that this type of assessment be conducted. But I would like to center on two analogies that you pointed out very properly. First, if we look at the actions of Pope Pius in terms of Nazi Germany, I think universally there is a condemnation, okay? Even though you may wish to give sanctity to the position of a pope, the belief is that what Pope Pius did was, in essence, enter into a concordant, an agreement with Satan. And that's what exactly happened. It was an agreement with Hitler that Hitler would not attack any Roman Catholic Church property. And because of that agreement to give the neutral ability of the Roman Catholic Church to exist wherever Hitler's reach was, the Vatican agreed, specifically agreed with the personification of Satan on earth with Hitler, that it would not make any pronouncements against Nazism and the actions of the state. To me, that is totally and completely reprehensible, and I think it is universally reprehensible. And I would suggest to you that Pope Francis has, in essence, also struck an agreement with today's Satan, and that is Putin. First, I believe that the action of the Pope to completely desecrate the dignity of his position, and going to a consulate of the Russian Empire, because that's what it is, to go and talk about issues like the war in Ukraine was completely undignified, and it was totally unacceptable. And I am surprised that the cardinals around the world have not stepped forth condemning that type of undiplomatic approach. That's issue number one. I know I need to slow down and say less. The second, I know I have keepers, everybody has keepers. The second thing that I think is absolutely undignified and reprehensible is that there was never an outright condemnation of, as you pointed out, aggression, just war. Putin presents this as a just war. Putin's argument is exactly the same as the argument that would be placed on the table of we are fully entitled to conduct this war because we are threatened. We are threatened by the existence of Ukrainians. Just being a Ukrainian is a sufficient threat, so therefore we are fully entitled to our effort to extinguish that nation from the face of the earth. That type of condemnation, unfortunately, has not been presented. Okay? So I believe that that is morally reprehensible. Now, when we look at the assessment of where you took it today, was the issue of walking a tightrope. Okay? When you walk a tightrope, or you walk a rope even, you do it very carefully because you don't want to hit the ground, right? You don't want to hit the ground and die. The Pope is walking this tightrope for what purpose? That's what we need to ask. For what purpose? Is the purpose truly this belief in an ecumenical approach of finally being invited by the Moscow Patriarch to come to Moscow and to be driven around the Kremlin, that Catholicism and Orthodoxy are having a common conversation? This is a false hope and a false God. So to me, okay, let me just finish one more sentence, okay? To me, this is a subject that needs to be discussed. I think we are tremendously honored to have you here today because the entire Ukrainian community does follow your writing, and I'm so pleased to meet you here in person. Let's talk about these subjects and let's expand on them. It's not enough for us to just say, well, we heard about this problem and let's digest it. I am personally appalled that we do not have here for your lecture a considerable representation of Ukrainian clergy. They need to be listening to this discussion. That we need to have our church leadership step forth and stand up for its people, for its people. It's not about fealty and loyalty to Rome. It's not about fealty to the Pope. It's about your pastoral responsibility. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Too many questions, but I will react shortly. So, yes, I agree with you that this is a big illusion that you can set some agreement, ecumenical agreement, to reach unity with the Orthodox Church, having dialogue with the Moscow Patriarchate, because they are just instrumentalizing this dialogue because they want to achieve their Roman goals, which aren't really religious and ecclesiastical. We have some priests here, so I think that they can deliver this this discussion, this information to their brothers in the priesthood. So, another question that I would like to comment. Yes, this is a very broad question about different popes' speeches, and so I tried to to make a dense presentation because you can read a lot of them on the internet, in newspapers. One more comment about the Pius XII and the relations with Nazi Germany. This is a very hard and complicated topic because the archives were just opened in the Vatican, and the historians just started to to research in these archives. So we don't have a really full picture of that history. But there are a lot of parallels, of course, between Pius XII and Pope Francis. That's why I quoted a lot from Pius XII, and you have seen that after the war, Pope Pius changed his mind. His speeches were very different from, silent diplomacy, which he walked alone during the wartime. After the war, he was a very, his speeches were more brave and he was more strict, and he talked about that if one nation is attacked, no one cannot abandon it. But what happened with Poland in 1939? So after the war, Pope Pius XII, I think, changed his mind, and we need to admit this, of course. We'll see what will happen after this war with Pope Francis, but I think that the key to the understanding of his stance, I think that his personality is very important, because he sees this world. Your remark about his visit to the Russian embassy, this is a very interesting question. What they told him, I've heard different versions. What Russians told him. And one was that he was told that no worries, there will be only a change of political regime and everything will be all right. So, and he's not very, it doesn't matter for him what political regime that or that country has. Maybe to some extent, but not to, not too much. We can see this on the example of his dialogue with China. So for John Paul II, the issue of human rights was a crucial one in the dialogue with China. But we see that for Pope Francis, communist regime doesn't matter. And he tries not to speak about human rights, but for him, the primary issue is to secure the existence of Catholic communities within China. So maybe he was told that, okay, there will be another political regime, more pro-Russian in Ukraine, and that's it. And maybe he agreed. We don't know. So.
Regarding the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, the bishops have been pretty strong in declaring what this is, and even meeting with Pope Francis. They had an extra hour with him at the
Yeah.
Synod. Is that yielding anything? Has his Beatitude, Sviatoslav's dialogue with the Pope, or Archbishop Wozniak's direct comments to the Pope, has it yielded any kind of greater understanding on Pope Francis' part of what's at stake here?
Yes, I think yes. About the position of Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, I think that the stance of his beatitude was very strong, and he had courage to argue with the Pope. I think that yes, Ukrainian bishops influenced on Pope's position very much because. If you remember, there was a synod of Ukrainian bishops in Rome about a year ago. So after this synod, there were no, ambiguous speeches on Pope's side until his speech about the white flag. So about a half of a year, everything was okay. so yes, they talked to him for a long time, and I think that helped. Yes. So.
Well, I think this is an inexhaustible topic, and if you wish, we can continue in a more casual environment. That being said, I invite everyone for our traditional buffet. I would like to express words of my gratitude to Dr. Babynskyi for organizing and gathering us for this wonderful, interesting meeting. All the best in your research. Thank you, and I hope this is not your last visit to St. Sophia.
I hope so.
I hope so too. And whoever is attending our lectures, I would like to inform you that we start on September 5th. The program is at the registration table. Please get one, and I'm going to see you in, 2 months? Thank you very much. God bless you.